Hello everyone, welcome back to our lecture series on Japanese history. And today I'm going to talk about the Middle Ages in Japan, and especially I'm going to focus on the Genpei War, the end of the Heian period, and the beginning of the Kamakura period, and then go all the way until the end of the Kamakura period and talk about some of the main events and social transformations that occurred at that time. So let's get started. Okay, the Middle Ages in Japan. Now the Heian period ended with the Genpei War, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to this. So in 1166, the Taira, or Heikei, as their name is alternatively read, were a military power who were supported by some of the aristocracy and local elites, but they started to gain power in Kyoto. And the head of the Taira was Taira Kiyomori. And eventually they took over. He ruled for decades, and they banished their political rivals, especially Minamoto no Yoritomo, to Kamakura, and then also took other actions like arresting Emperor Go Shirakawa. So really asserting themselves over the aristocracy and the emperor, banishing political rivals, and installing themselves as at the head of political power. But the Minamoto actually, this wasn't the end of them. They came back and launched another massive attack against the Taira. In 1180, Yoritomo and his brother Yoshitsune led what became the Genpei War against Taira Kiyomori and the rest of the Taira. They drove the Taira to the sea in the Battle of Dannoura, where Lady Ni and Kiyomori's grandson famously jumped into the ocean, and this marked the end of the short-lived rule, just a few decades long rule by the Taira. And the events of the Genpei War were famously described in one of the most notable and well-known works of early Japanese literature, the tale of the Heikei Monogatari. And what's interesting is that this is written from the perspective of the losers, from the perspective of the Heikei and especially Kiyomori and his offspring. It's not written by the losers, of course, but it's written from the perspective of the losers, and it kind of actually beautifies their defeat. And describes the battles between the Taira and the Minamoto. Minamoto were also known as Genji, from 1180 to 1185. Originally, the tales and the events of the Heikei Monogatari, which themselves, of course, were just describing the events of the Genpei War, were narrated as oral stories and would have been sung by these traveling, presumably blind, biwa players, or biwa hoshi. They were also eventually written down by Buddhist priests, and in the process, they absorbed many setsuwa tales, these kind of moral fairy tales that had some kind of didactic message to them, and imbued them as well with Buddhist influences. And eventually, what then became the tale of the Heikei Monogatari was codified as a written narrative around 1371 by Kakuichi. But this was, of course, much later, two centuries later, after the events had happened, it finally becomes kind of codified into a written narrative. And I want to look at just the famous opening lines of Heikei Monogatari and talk about some of the religious meaning behind this. And as I mentioned, the stories of the Genpei War became imbued with this religious meaning. So I want to look at some of this. So in Japanese, it reads, Gion shouja no kane no koe, shogyo mujo no hibiki ari, shara soju no hana no iro, jo, josha hisui no kotowari o arawasu. And then it goes on a bit. おごれる人も叱らず、ただ春の夜の夢のごとし、高き者も、ついに、は滅びぬ、ひとえに風の前の塵に、同じ。And in English, it has been translated by Haruo Shirane as follows. The bells of the Gion monastery in India echo with the warning that all things are impermanent. The blossoms of the sala trees teach us through their hues that what flourishes must fade. The proud do not prevail for long, but vanish like a spring night's dream. In time, the mighty too succumb. All are dust before the wind. And now the reason why I included the Japanese here and read it aloud rather poorly in Japanese is because of the background to these individual phrases and terms. And I want to just look at some of these and explain what these are. So, Gion Shoja, for instance, this first phrase, this actually refers to not Gion in Kyoto, but the Jetavana monastery, which was donated by Anathapindika to Buddha and his followers, to Siddhartha, right? And his followers. And he was this just means wealthy or rich person. And so he was a wealthy individual who donated then this monastery so that Siddhartha would have a place to preach. And shoja here just actually means temple in Japanese, otera. Shogyo mujo is a term that is frequently used in Japanese, but it originally comes from the Nirvana Sutra. In Japanese, this is Nehangyo. Nehan being nirvana, and kyo is just sutra. And this means that all things are impermanent and subject to change. Shara soju refers to the sala tree, type of tree in India. However, the reference here is specifically to the sala trees in the garden where Siddhartha meditated and whose leaves turned white at the time of his enlightenment, reportedly. And then Josha Hisui here, this is a line from another sutra, the Humane King Sutra, or Ninno-gyo in Japanese. And this means that all things must come to an end, referring in the context of the Heike Monogatari to the end of the Heike clan. Okay, so after then the Minamoto are victorious in the Genpei War, Minamoto no Yoritomo has himself named Seitai Shogun by the emperor. And this is a title that grants him pretty much supreme power in the land. And then he goes and establishes a new government, what's called in English sometimes a tent government, or like a military government, in a new location in Kamakura. And so this is where then the name Kamakura Period comes from, or Kamakura Bakufu. And this is in 1192. And Japanese students often remember this year because it sounds like, when you read it in Japanese, I Kuni. And then Yoritomo immediately moved to solidify his rule and his political power. He had his own brother killed, Yoshitsune, and other members of his family who he thought might try to supplant his power. he suppressed the northern Fujiwara clan whose headquarters were near Hiraizumi. In Japanese, they're known as the Oshu Fujiwara. I talked about this group actually in a previous lecture and their connections to the Emishi as well. And then Yoritomo also, in the system of government and law that he set up, he challenged the Ritsuryo system that had been in place until this time, all the way from the Nara period, by appointing his own state stewards, Jito, who would run government affairs, watch over the court, for instance, and then they also were in charge of the various shoen. And he also appointed the military governors, shugo, in each province. And a major job of them as well, and of the Kamakura government, was the collection of taxes, of taxation. So he's really running national government at this point. In society, in the Kamakura period, the samurai class, this warrior class, then starts to become prominent. And what's interesting is that most of them have really no connection to the aristocracy. They're mostly of humble origin, so it's the creation of an entirely new class. And then the creation of two capitals between Kamakura and Kyoto, located quite far away. Kamakura in now present-day Kanagawa prefecture near Tokyo. This created a lot of increased travel and business, actually. So you have people now moving back and forth between here, and it creates all kinds of new shops and whatnot along the way, along the route between these two cities. After Yoritomo died in 1199, his widow, who was actually associated with his previous political rivals initially, but absconded from them to marry Yoritomo, Hojo Masako, took over. Power went to her, and then she and the Hojo family ruled as regents called shikken until 1330. And this is an interesting example of land and power passing to the woman's family at this time. And as I'll touch on in a moment, male-female relations did change a bit at this time and become initially a bit more equal, or relations between men and women, legally speaking, became a bit more equal. And Masako then exercised her power and asserted her control, for instance, very notably during the Jokyu no Ran, Jokyu Rebellion in 1221, which was when Emperor Gotaba, who I also mentioned in a previous lecture, was dissatisfied with the Kamakura government, and he wanted to take power back for the emperors themselves. Himself included, obviously, tried to overthrow, and he and some others tried to overthrow the Kamakura Bakufu. They failed, and Emperor Gotaba was then banished. So then, after this really even more asserted, Kamakura rule, and emphasized that the Kamakura Bakufu was in control of things and not the court and aristocracy in Kyoto. So I mentioned law and the position of women in society, and I want to look at this in a little bit more detail, how things changed in the Kamakura period. So Hojo Yasutoki, Masako's father, who took over as the first regent, really, in 1232, he passed what were known as the Joei codes. Sorry, this should be a D there. Codes. And this contrast with the earlier Taiho codes, which were basically the law of the land governing the aristocracy. And one noticeable difference between these two codes, and Jōei codes being for warrior families, Taiho codes for the aristocracy, was that the Jōei codes allowed for individual possession of land by women. And I want to just read a couple of the passages from the Jōei codes. So, for instance, one of them read, "Legal scholars have held that, although sons and daughters differ in gender, they are equal in terms of the benefits bestowed upon them by their parents. Hence, a gift to a daughter should be as irrevocable as one to a son." So talking about how daughters can inherit land and other things as well. And then another passage read, "From the time of Lord Yoritomo to the present day, it has been a fixed rule to allow a childless woman to bequeath her land to an adopted child." So if a woman was divorced, or if her husband had died, or if the family didn't have children, for instance, and a woman who was in control of the land needed someone to pass the land on to, she could adopt a child in that case. So this is quite a bit of legal power, actually. And of course, this is mainly just for warrior families, these laws. But nonetheless, many of these warriors, as I explained, were previously peasants or people of lower rank. So it was, in a sense, quite radical, even though these laws eventually, as we'll see in later periods, were again reversed. Okay, and then just talking about some of the other main events of the late Kamakura period. The Kamakura period is notable especially for two separate Mongol invasions when Kublai Khan, who had, as the Mongols took over Korea and then attempted to move from there to Japan, and landing twice in around Hakata Bay in Kyushu, and attacking Japanese forces there and fighting with Japanese forces, sometimes in the second case for months. But in both cases, they were eventually turned away by storms, hurricanes, and the fleets were sunk as well. And so this kind of resulted then in a Japanese victory. It was basically like the Kamakura Bakufu getting lucky in a sense. But at the same time, they were rather unlucky in that in just preparing for these invasions, the Bakufu invested great amounts of money in the military, and not just in mobilizing a military, but in sending that military to Kyushu and stationing them there permanently, because they didn't know when the Mongols were going to return. And Kyushu and Kamakura are quite far away. It's a long distance to travel, even today, but certainly even more so at this time. So this put a lot of pressure on government coffers, and in fact, eventually the inability to pay the soldiers led to a discontent among people and the samurai. And in a way then this connected with events that followed when the Ashikaga clan, another military family, conspired with Emperor Go-Daigo to overthrow the Hojo family. And they did this in 1330, and this is known as the Kemu Restoration. Kusunoki Masashige was a famous warrior from that time who fought in the service of Emperor Go-Daigo against the Kamakura Bakufu, and the image of Kusunoki will eventually be, much later in the Meiji period, invoked again as kind of a model of samurai loyalty to, or warrior loyalty to the emperor. And then in 1338, Ashikaga Takuji becomes the new shogun, and he moved the capital to the Muromachi area of Kyoto. And so then this becomes known as the Muromachi area Muromachi era, which succeeds the Kamakura Bakufu. Okay, so I just want to then, in conclusion, to reflect back on some of the contents of my lecture, and we can do this by thinking about these 5 questions. What are the contents of the Heike Monogatari, and how and when was it written and assembled? Number 2, how did the Heike Monogatari use Buddhist imagery and language? Should be a question mark there. Number 3, how did Minamoto no Yoritomo use violence and politics another spelling error there, to solidify his rule? Who took over after Yoritomo? And what were some of the major events during this time? And then number 5, describe the position of women in Kamakura society. So, in thinking about these 5 questions, this will be an opportunity to just kind of reflect back on some of the contents of the lecture and to think about some of the main events and happenings of this time period. Okay, and that's the end of my lecture for today. I'm going to continue talking about the Kamakura period next time, and especially look at how religion changed during this time, and look at some of the other developments in society and literature and the arts, for instance. But I'm going to save that for next time. I mainly just talked about some of the major events that happened, especially and then looked at some of the changes regarding law and society, position of women, etc. In this lecture. So I hope you've found it somewhat enlightening, and look forward to seeing you next time for the continuation of this lecture series. Thank you.